Chapter 21 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. 21. Some Transactions in Scalps. History would be a very orderly affair could the dry-as-dust historians have their way, and doubtless it would be thrillingly romantic at every turn if the novelists were able to control its current. Fortunately, neither one nor the other has much influence, and the result in the long run is that most novels are shockingly tame, while the large body of history is loaded down with picturesque incidents which if used in fiction would be thought absurdly romantic and improbable. Were our simple story of Old Vincennes a mere fiction, we should hesitate to bring in the explosion of a magazine at the fort with a view to sudden confusion and, by that means, distracting attention from our heroine while she betakes herself out of a situation which, although delightful enough for a blessed minute, has quickly become an embarrassment quite unendurable. But we simply adhere to the established facts in history. Owing to some carelessness there was indeed an explosion of 26 6-pound cartridges, which made a mighty roar and struck the newly installed garrison into a heap, so to say, scattering things terribly and wounding 6 men, among them Captains Bowman and Worthington. After the thunderous crash came a momentary silence, which embraced both the people within the fort and the wild crowd outside. Then the rush and noise were indescribable. Even Clarke gave way to excitement, losing command of himself and, of course, of his men. There was a stampede toward the main gate by one wing of the troops in the hollow square. They literally ran over Beverly and Alice, flinging them apart and jostling them hither and yonder without mercy. Of course the turmoil quickly subsided. Clarke and Beverly got hold of themselves and sang out their peremptory orders with excellent effect. It was like oil on raging water. The men obeyed in a straggling way, getting back into ranks as best they could. "Ventre bleu!" squeaked Oncle Jason. "If I didn't think the whole world had busted into 1,000,000 pieces!" He was jumping up and down not 3 feet from Beverly's toes, waving his cap excitedly. "But wasn't I scared? Ya, ya, ya! Vive la bannière d'Alice Roussillon! Vive Georges Washington!" Hearing Alice's name caused Beverly to look around. Where was she? In the distance he saw Father Beret hurrying to the spot where some of the men burnt and wounded by the explosion were being stripped and cared for. Hamilton stood like a statue. He appeared to be the only cool person in the fort. "Where is Alice? Miss Roussillon? Where did Miss Roussillon go?" Beverly exclaimed, staring around like a lost man. "Where is she?" "Dunno," said Oncle Jason, resuming his habitual expression of droll dignity. "She shot past me jest as that thing busted loose, and she went like her a hummin' bird, skitch! Jest that way, and I didn't see her no more. 'Cause I was skeert mighty nigh inter 7 feets. 'Spect that 'splosion blowed her clean away. Ventre bleu! Never was so plumb out'n breath and dead crazy weak a bein' afeard." "Lieutenant Beverly!" roared Clarke in his most commanding tone. "Go to the gate and settle things there. That mob outside is trying to break in." The order was instantly obeyed, but Beverly had relapsed. Once more his soul groped in darkness, while the whole of his life seemed unreal, a wavering, misty, hollow dream. And yet his military duty was all real enough. He knew just what to do when he reached the gate. "Back there at once!" he commanded, not loudly, but with intense force. "Back there!" This to the inward surging wedge of excited outsiders. Then to the guard. "Shoot the first man who crosses the line." "Zif, me voici! Moi, Gaspard Roussillon! Laissez-moi passer, messieurs!" A great body hurled itself frantically past Beverly and the guard, going out through the gateway against the wall of the crowd, bearing everything before it, and shouting, "Back, fools! You'll all be killed! The powder is on fire! Zif, run!" Wild as a March hare, he bristled with terror and foamed at the mouth. He stampeded the entire mass. There was a wild howl, a rush in the other direction followed, and soon enough the esplanade and all the space back to the barricades and beyond were quite deserted. Alice was not aware that a serious accident had happened. Naturally she thought the great rattling crashing noise of the explosion a mere part of the spectacular show. When the rush followed, separating her and Beverley, it was a great relief to her in some way; for a sudden recognition of the boldness of her action in the little scene just ended came over her and bewildered her. An impulse sent her running away from the spot where it seemed to her she had invited public derision. The terrible noises all around her were, she now fancied, but the jeering and hooting of rude men who had seen her unmaidenly forwardness. With a burning face she flew to the postern and slipped out, once more taking the course which had become so familiar to her feet. She did not slacken her speed until she reached the Boursier cabin, where she had made her home since the night when Hamilton's pistol ball struck her. The little domicile was quite empty of its household, but Alice entered and flung herself into a chair, where she sat quivering and breathless when Adrienne, also much excited, came in, preceded by a stream of patois that sparkled continuously. "The fort is blown up!" she cried, gesticulating in every direction at once, her petite figure comically dilated with the importance of her statement. 100 men are killed and the powder is on fire. She pounced into Alice's arms, still talking as fast as her tongue could vibrate, changing from subject to subject without rhyme or reason, her prattle making its way by skips and shies until what was really uppermost in her sweet little heart disclosed itself. "And oh, Alice, René has not come yet." She plunged her dusky face between Alice's cheek and shoulder. Alice hugged her sympathetically and said, "But René will come. I know he will, dear." "Oh, but do you know it? Is it true? Who told you? When will he come? Where is he? Tell me about him." Her head popped up from her friend's neck, and she smiled brilliantly through the tears that were still sparkling on her long black lashes. "I didn't mean that I had heard from him, and I don't know where he is. But they always come back." "You say that because your man, because Lieutenant Beverley has returned. It is always so. You have everything to make you happy, while I Again her eyes spilled their shower, and she hid her face in her hands, which Alice tried in vain to remove. "Don't cry, Adrienne. You didn't see me crying." "No, of course not. You didn't have a thing to cry about. Lieutenant Beverley told you just where he was going, and just what. But think, Adrienne, only think of the awful story they told, that he was killed, that Governor Hamilton had paid Longhair for killing him and bringing back his scalp. Oh, dear, just think! And I thought it was true." "Well, I'd be willing to think and believe anything in the world if René would come back," said Adrienne, her face now uncovered, showing pitiful lines of suffering. "Oh, Alice, Alice! And he never, never will come." Alice exhausted every device to cheer, encourage, and comfort her. Adrienne had been so good to her when she lay recovering from the shock of Hamilton's pistol bullet, which, although it came near killing her, made no serious wound, only a bruise, in fact. It was one of those fortunate accidents or providentially ordered interferences which once in a while save a life. The stone disc worn by Alice chanced to lie exactly in the missile's way, and while it was not broken, the ball, already somewhat checked by passing through several folds of Father Beret's garments, flattened itself upon it with a shock which somehow struck Alice senseless. Here again history in the form of an ancient family document, a letter written in 1821 by Alice herself, gives us the curious brace of incidents, to wit, the breaking of the miniature on Beverley's breast by a British musket ball, and the stopping of Hamilton's bullet over Alice's heart by the Indian charm stone. "Which shows the goodness of God," the letter goes on, and also seems to sustain the Indian legend concerning the stone that whoever might wear it could not be killed. Unquestionable, Mr. Hamilton's shot, which was aimed at poor dear old Father Beret, would have pierced my heart, but for that charm stone. As for my locket, it did not, as some have reported, save Fitzhugh's life when the musket ball was stopped. The ball was so spent that the blow was only hard enough to spoil temporarily the face of the miniature, which was afterwards restored fairly well by an artist in Paris. When it did actually save Fitzhugh's life was out on the Illinois plain. The savage Longhair, peace to his memory, worked the miracle of restoring to me. Here a fold in the paper has destroyed a line of the writing. The letter is a sacred family paper, and there is not justification for going farther into its faded and, in some parts, almost obliterated writing. But so much may pass into these pages as a pleasant authentication of what otherwise might be altogether too sweet a double nut for the critic's teeth to crack. While Adrienne and Alice were still discussing the probability of René de Ronville's return, M. Roussillon came to the door. He was in search of Madame, his wife, whom he had not yet seen. He gathered the two girls in his mighty arms, tousling them with rough tenderness. Alice returned his affectionate embrace, and told him where to find Madame Roussillon, who was with Dame Godert, probably at her house. "Nobody killed," he said in answer to Alice's inquiry about the catastrophe at the fort. "Some of 'em hurt and burnt a little. Great big scare about nearly nothing. Zif, my children, you should have seen me quiet things. I put out my hands this way, comme ça, pouf! It was all over. The people went home." His gestures indicated that he had borne back an army with open hands. Then he chucked Adrienne under the chin with his finger, and added in his softest voice, "I saw somebody's lover the other day, over yonder, in the Indian village. He spoke to me about somebody. Eh, ma petite, que voulez-vous dire?" "Oh, Papa Roussillon, we were just talking about René," cried Alice. "Have you seen him?" "I saw you, you little minx, jumping into a man's arms right under the eyes of a whole garrison. Bah! I could not believe it was my little Alice." He let go a grand guffaw which seemed to shake the cabin's walls. Alice blushed cherry red. Adrienne, too bashful to inquire about René, was trembling with anxiety. The truth was not in Gaspard Roussillon just then, or if it was it stayed in him, for he had not seen René de Ronville. It was his generous desire to please and to appear opulent of knowledge and sympathy that made him speak. He knew what would please Adrienne, so why not give her at least a delicious foretaste? Surely when a thing was so cheap one need not be so parsimonious as to withhold a mere anticipation. He was off before the girls could press him into details, for indeed he had none. "There now, what did I tell you?" cried Alice when the big man was gone. "I told you René would come. They always come back." Father Beret came in a little later. As soon as he saw Alice he frowned and began to shake his head; but she only laughed, and imitating his hypocritical scowl, yet fringing it with a twinkle of merry lines and dimples, pointed a taper finger at him and exclaimed, "You bad, bad man! Why did you pretend to me that Lieutenant Beverley was dead? What sinister ecclesiastical motive prompted you to describe how Longhair scalped him? Ah, father!" The priest laid a broad hand over her saucy mouth. "Something or other seems to have excited you mightily, ma fille. You are a trifle impulsively inclined to day." "Yes, Father Beret. Yes, I know, and I am ashamed. My heart shrinks when I think of what I did. But I was so glad, such a grand joy came all over me when I saw him, so strong and brave and beautiful, coming toward me, smiling that warm, glad smile, and holding out his arms. Ah! When I saw all that, when I knew for sure that he was not dead, why, father, I just had to. I couldn't help it." Father Beret laughed in spite of himself, but quickly managed to resume his severe countenance. "Ta, ta!" he exclaimed. "It was a bold thing for a little girl to do." "So it was, so it was. But it was also a bold thing for him to do, to come back after he was dead and scalped and look so handsome and grand. I'm ashamed and sorry, father. But I'm afraid I might do it again well, I don't care if I did. So there now." "But what in the world are you talking about?" interposed Adrienne. Evidently they were discussing a most interesting matter of which she knew nothing, and that did not suit her feminine curiosity. "Tell me." She pulled Father Beret's sleeve. "Tell me, I say." It is probable that Father Beret would have pretended to betray Alice's source of mingled delight and embarrassment, had not the rest of the Boursier household returned in time to break up the conversation. A little later Alice gave Adrienne a vividly dramatic account of the whole scene. "Ah, mon Dieu!" exclaimed the petite brunette after she had heard the exciting story. "That was just like you, Alice. You always do superb things. You were born to do them. You shoot Captain Farnsworth, you wound Lieutenant Barlow,
You climb on to the fort and set up your flag. You take it down again and run away with it. You get shot and you do not die. You kiss your lover right before a whole garrison. Bon Dieu! If I could but do all those things!"
She clasped her tiny hands before her, and added rather dejectedly,
"But I couldn't. I couldn't kiss a man in that way."
Late in the evening news came to Roussillon Place, where Gaspard Roussillon was once more happy in the midst of his little family, that the Indian Longhair had just been brought to the fort and would be shot on the following day. A scouting party captured him as he approached the town, bearing at his belt the fresh scalp of a white man. He would have been killed forthwith, but Clarke, who wished to avoid a repetition of the savage vengeance meted out to the Indians on the previous day, had given strict orders that all prisoners should be brought into the fort, where they were to have a fair trial by court-martial. Both Helm and Beverley were at Roussillon Place, the former sipping wine and chatting with Gaspard, the latter of course hovering around Alice, after the manner of a hungry bee around a particularly sweet and deliciously refractory flower. It was raining slowly, the fine drops coming straight down through the cold, still February air. But the two young people found it pleasant enough for them on the veranda, where they walked back and forth, making fair exchange of the exciting experiences which had befallen them during their long separation. Between the lines of these mutual recitals sweet, fresh echoes of the old story went from heart to heart, an Amabean love-bout like that of spring birds calling tenderly back and forth in the blooming Maytime woods. Both Captain Helm and Monsieur Roussillon were delighted to hear of Longhair's capture and certain fate, but neither of them regarded the news as of sufficient importance to need much comment. They did not think of telling Beverley and Alice. Jean, however, lying awake in his little bed, overheard the conversation, which he repeated to Alice next morning with great circumstantiality. Having the quick insight bred of frontier experience, Alice instantly caught the terrible significance of the dilemma in which she and Beverley would be placed by Longhair's situation. Moreover, something in her heart arose with irresistible power demanding the final, the absolute human sympathy and gratitude. No matter what deeds Longhair had committed that were evil beyond forgiveness, he had done for her the all-atoning thing. He had saved Beverley and sent him back to her. With a start and a chill of dread she thought, "What if it is already too late?" But her nature could not hesitate. To feel the demand of an exigency was to act. She snatched a wrap from its peg on the wall and ran as fast as she could to the fort. People who met her flying along wondered, staring after her, what could be urging her so that she saw nobody, checked herself for nothing, ran splashing through the puddles in the street, gazing ahead of her, as if pursuing some flying object from which she dared not turn her eyes. And there was indeed a call for her utmost power of flight if she would be of any assistance to Longhair, who even then stood bound to a stake in the fort's area, while a platoon of riflemen, those unerring shots from Kentucky and Virginia, were ready to make a target of him at a range of but 20 yards. Beverley, greatly handicapped by the fact that the fresh scalp of a white man hung at Longhair's belt, had exhausted every possible argument to avert or mitigate the sentence promptly spoken by the court-martial of which Colonel Clarke was the ruling spirit. He had succeeded barely to the extent of turning the mode of execution from tomahawking to shooting. All the officers in the fort approved killing the prisoner, and it was difficult for Colonel Clarke to prevent the men from making outrageous assaults upon him, so exasperated were they at the sight of the scalp. Oncle Jason proved to be one of the most refractory among those who demanded tomahawking and scalping as the only treatment due Longhair. The repulsive savage stood up before them, stolid, resolute, defiant, proudly flaunting the badge which testified to his horrible efficiency as an emissary of Hamilton's. It had been left in his belt by Clarke's order as the best justification of his doom.
"Help me hack his damned head," Oncle Jason pleaded. "I just hankers to chop a hole into it. And besides, I want his scalp to hang up with mine and that of the Indian what scalped me. He kicked me in the ribs, the stinking varmint."
Beverley pleaded eloquently and well, but even the genial Major Helm laughed at his sentiment of gratitude to a savage who had best but relented at the last moment, for Alice's sake, and concluded not to sell him to Hamilton. It is due to the British commander to record here that he must positively, and with what appeared to be high sincerity, denied the charge of having offered rewards for the taking of human scalps. He declared that his purposes and practices were humane, and that while he did use the Indians as military allies, his orders to them were that they must forego cruel modes of warfare and refrain from savage outrage upon prisoners. Certainly the weight of contemporary testimony seems overwhelmingly against him, but we enter his denial. Longhair himself, however, taunted him with accusations of unfaithfulness in carrying out some very inhuman contracts, and to add a terrible sting, volunteered the statement that poor Barlow's scalp had served his turn in the place of Beverly's. With conditions so hideous to contend against, Beverly of course had no possible means of succoring the condemned savage.
"Him a kickin' your ribs clean inter ye, and a makin' ye run the gauntlet, and here ye are a tryin' to save his life,"
whined Oncle Jason.
"Why, man, I thought ye had some sentiments. Dast his Indian liver. I can feel them kicks what he guv me till yet. Ventrebleu, que diable voulez-vous?"
Clarke simply pushed Beverly's pleadings aside as not worth a moment's consideration. He easily felt a fine bit of gratitude at the bottom of it all, but there was too much in the other side of the balance: justice, the discipline and confidence of his little army, and the claim of the women and children on the frontier demanded firmness in dealing with a case like Longhair's. "No, no," he said to Beverly, "I would do anything in the world for you, Fitz, except to swerve an inch from duty to my country and the defenseless people down yonder in Kentucky. I can't do it. There's no use to press the matter further. The die is cast. That brute's got to be killed, and killed dead. Look at him. Look at that scalp. I'd have him killed if I dropped dead for it the next instant." Beverly shuddered. The argument was horribly convincing, and yet somehow the desire to save Longhair overbore everything else in his mind. He could not cease his efforts. It seemed to him as if he were pleading for Alice herself. Captain Farnsworth, strange to say, was the only man in the fort who leaned to Beverly's side, but he was reticent, doubtless feeling that his position as a British prisoner gave him no right to speak, especially when every lip around him was muttering something about infamous scalp buyers and Indian partisans, with whom he was prominently counted by the speakers. As Clarke had said, the die was cast. Longhair bound to a stake, the scalp still dangling at his side, grimly faced his executioners, who were eager to fire. He appeared to be proud of the fact that he was going to be killed. "One thing I can say of him," Helm remarked to Beverly, "he's the grandest specimen of the animal. I might say the brute, man that I ever saw, red, white, or black. Just look at his body and limbs. Those muscles are perfectly marvelous. He saved my life, and I must stand here and see him murdered," the young man replied with intense bitterness. It was all he could think, all that he could say. He felt inefficient and dejected, almost desperate. Clarke himself, not willing to cast responsibility upon a subordinate, made ready to give the fatal order. Turning to Longhair first, he demanded of him, as well as he could in the Indian dialect, of which he had a smattering, what he had to say at his last moment. The Indian straightened his already upright form, and by a strong bulging of his muscles snapped the thongs that bound him. Evidently he had not tried thus to free himself. It was rather a spasmodic expression of savage dignity and pride. One arm and both his legs still were partially confined by the bonds, but his right hand he lifted with a gesture of immense self-satisfaction, and pointed at Hamilton. "Indian brave, white man coward," he said, scowling scornfully. "Longhair tell truth, white man lie, damn." Hamilton's countenance did not change its calm, cold expression. Longhair gazed at him fixedly for a long moment, his eyes flashing most concentrated hate and contempt. Then he tore the scalp from his belt, and flung it with great force straight toward the captive governor's face. It fell short, but the look that went with it did not, and Hamilton recoiled. At that moment Alice arrived. Her coming was just in time to interrupt Clarke, who had turned to the waiting platoon with the order of death on his lips. She made no noise, save the fluttering of her skirts, and her loud and rapid panting on account of her long, hard run. She sprang before Longhair and faced the platoon. "You cannot, you shall not kill this man," she cried in a voice loaded with excitement. "Put away those guns." Woman never looked more thrillingly beautiful to man than she did just then to all those rough, stern backwoodsmen. During her flight her hair had fallen down, and it glimmered like soft sunlight around her face. Something compelling flashed out of her eyes, an expression between a triumphant smile and a ray of irresistible beseechment. It took Colonel Clarke's breath when he turned and saw her standing there and heard her words. "This man saved Lieutenant Beverley's life," she presently added, getting better control of her voice, and sending into it a thrilling timbre. "You shall not harm him. You must not do it." Beverley was astounded when he saw her, the thing was so unexpected, so daring, and done with such high imperious force. Still it was but a realization of what he had imagined she would be upon occasion. He stood gazing at her, as did all the rest, while she faced Clarke and the platoon of riflemen. To hear his own name pass her quivering lips in that tone and in that connection seemed to him a consecration. "Would you be more savage than your Indian prisoner?" she went on. "Less grateful than he for a life saved? I did him a very small service once, and in memory of that he saved Lieutenant Beverley's life, because she faltered for a single breath, then added clearly and with magnetic sweetness, because Lieutenant Beverley loved me, and because I loved him. This Indian Longhair showed a gratitude that could overcome his strongest passion. You white men should be ashamed to fall below his standard." Her words went home. It was as if the beauty of her face, the magnetism of her lissom and symmetrical form, the sweet fire of her eyes, and the passionate appeal of her voice gave what she said a new and irresistible force of truth. When she spoke of Beverley's love for her, and declared her love for him, there was not a manly heart in all the garrison that did not suddenly beat quicker and feel a strange, sweet waft of tenderness. A mother somewhere, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a sweetheart, called through that voice of absolute womanhood. "Beverley, what can I do?" muttered Clarke, his bronze face as pale as it could possibly become. "Do?" thundered Beverley. "Do? You cannot murder that man. Hamilton is the man you should shoot. He offered large rewards, he inflamed the passions and fed the love of rum and cupidity of poor wild men like the one standing yonder. Yet you take him prisoner and treat him with distinguished consideration. Hamilton offered a large sum for me taken alive, a smaller one for my scalp. Longhair saved me. You let Hamilton stand yonder in perfect safety while you shoot the Indian. Shame on you, Colonel Clarke. Shame on you if you do it." Alice stood looking at the stalwart commander while Beverley was pouring forth his torrent of scathing reference to Hamilton, and she quickly saw that Clarke was moved. The moment was ripe for the finishing stroke. They say it is genius that avails itself of opportunity. Beverley knew the fight was won when he saw what followed. Alice suddenly left Longhair and ran to Colonel Clarke, who felt her warm, strong arms loop round him for a single point of time, never to be effaced from his memory. Then he saw her kneeling at his feet, her hands upstretched, her face a glorious prayer, while she pleaded the Indian's cause, and won it. Doubtless, while we all rather feel that Clarke was weak to be thus swayed by a girl, we cannot quite blame him. Alice's flag was over him. He had heard her history from Beverley's cunning lips. He actually believed that Hamilton was the real culprit, and besides he felt not a little nauseated with executing Indians. A good excuse to have an end of it all did not go begging. But Longhair was barely gone over the horizon from the fort, as free and as villainous a savage as ever trod the earth, when a discovery made by Oncle Jason caused Clarke to hate himself for what he had done. The old scout picked up the scalp which Longhair had flung at Hamilton and examined it with odious curiosity. He had lingered on the spot with no other purpose than to get possession of that ghastly relic. Since losing his own scalp, the subject of crown locks had grown upon his mind until its fascination was irresistible. He studied the hair of every person he saw, as a physiognomist studies faces. He held the gruesome thing up before him, scrutinizing it with the expression of a connoisseur who had discovered on a grimy canvas the signature of an old master. "Sac bleu!" he presently broke forth. "Well, I'll be! Look'ee here, George Clarke. Come here and look. Ye've been sold again. Take a squint, if ye please." Colonel Clarke, with his hands crossed behind him, his face thoughtfully contracted, was walking slowly to and fro a little way off. He turned about when Oncle Jason spoke. "What now, Jason?"
"A mighty heap right now, that's what. Come here and let me show ye. You're a fine sort of idjit, now ain't ye?"
The two men walked toward each other and met. Oncle Jason held up the scalp with one hand, pointing at it with the index finger of the other.
"This here scalp come off'n René de Ronville's head."
"And who is he?"
"Who's he? Ye may well ax that. He was a Frenchman. He was a fine young feller o' this town. He killed a corporal o' Hamilton's, and tucked o'er the woods a month or two ago. Hamilton offered a lot o' money for him or his scalp, and Longhair went in for gettin' it. Now ye knows the whole racket. An' ye lets that Injun go. And that same Injun he mighty nigh kicked my ribs inter my stomach."
Oncle Jason's feelings were visible and audible, but Clarke could not resent the contempt of the old man's looks and words. He felt that he deserved far more than he was receiving. Nor was Oncle Jason wrong. René de Ronville never came back to little Adrienne Boursier, although, being kept entirely ignorant of her lover's fate, she waited and dreamed and hoped throughout more than 2 years, after which there is no further record of her life. Clarke, Beverley, and Oncle Jason consulted together, and agreed among themselves that they would hold profoundly secret the story of the scalp. To have made it public would have exasperated the Creoles and set them violently against Clarke, a thing heavy with disaster for all his future plans. As it was, the release of Longhair caused a great deal of dissatisfaction and mutinous talk. Even Beverley now felt that the execution ordered by the commander ought to have been sternly carried out. A day or two later, however, the whole dark affair was closed forever by a bit of confidence on the part of Oncle Jason, when Beverley dropped into his hut one evening to have a smoke with him. The rain was over, the sky shone like one vast luminary, with a nearly full moon and 1,000 stars reinforcing it. Up from the south poured one of those balmy accidental wind floods, sometimes due in February on the Wabash, full of tropical dream hints, yet edged with a winter chill that smacks of treachery. Oncle Jason was unusually talkative. He may have had a draught of liquor. At all events, Beverley had little room for a word.
"Well, being as it's twixt us, as his bosom friends," the old fellow presently said, "I'll just show you somepin porty."
He pricked the wick of a lamp and took down his bunch of scalps.
"I have been a-addin' one more to keep company o' mine and t'others."
He separated the latest acquisition from the rest of the wisp, and added with a heinous chuckle,
"This'n's Longhair's."
And so it was. Beverley knocked the ashes from his pipe and rose to go.
"When they kicks your Oncle Jason's ribs," the old man added, "they jest as well lay down and give up, for he's going to salivate 'em."
Then, after Beverley had passed out of the cabin, Oncle Jason chirruped after him,
"Mebbe ye'd better not tell little Alice. The poor little girl have had worry enough."
End of chapter 21.